Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. A brilliant and captivating debut, in the tradition of Alan Hollinghurst and Colm Tóibín, is how publishers Penguin describe The New Life by Tom Crewe. It's about two marriages, two forbidden love affairs, and the passionate search for social and sexual freedom in late 19th century London. In addition to appearing on many a literary editor's Best of 2023 list, the book has picked up a number of awards, while author Tom Crewe was recently crowned Sunday Times Young Novelist of the Year. In addition to his fiction credentials, Crewe has a PhD in 19th century British history and works as an editor for the London Review of Books. And so, anticipation was high as our podcast book club dived in, but what did we make of it? I'll be reporting back. Joining me from New York to discuss it is friend and regular guest, journalist Phil Chaffee. If a temperature gauge could measure our feelings, one of us would be red hot and the other lukewarm, but who thought what? Listen in to find out, plus our thoughts on recent reads Fake Accounts by Lauren Oyler and The North Woods by Daniel Mason. And, inspired by The New Life, we'll also bring you our pick of follow-on recommendations. All that coming up, here on the Book Club Review. Phil, very nice to see you as ever.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we get to The New Life, what have you been reading recently?
A couple of things. I've been slowly working through all of John le Carré's Smiley novels. I'm loving those. They need no recommendation. But the book I just finished, which I absolutely adored, was North Woods by Daniel Mason. Have you heard of this? Is it on your radar?
I have. Yeah, even here, that's had a bit of a profile.
Yeah. It basically follows a house or a cabin initially, becomes a house, becomes abandoned over the centuries. It starts in the 17th century. This is in New England. And it keeps on jumping forward to new occupants of this house over the years, but also jumping genres. Reading that initially, I was like, I don't really think that's my thing. But Daniel Mason is such a curious, sparkling writer that as he dips into all these genres, it just works. The reference I kept on thinking of was Francis Spufford with Light Eternal, where he just alights in talking about printing presses or talking about completely different things, and you get his enthusiasm from diving into these different topics. And the same thing here with this book. It was absolutely delightful jumping into different genres, different time periods, and such a beautiful, humane writer. I could not recommend it more. What about you, Kate?
Yeah, I can't wait to get to that one, actually. That's definitely on my radar. I've been reading a book by an American author called Lauren Oyler. Fake Accounts was her debut novel. I've been reading it because I am going to see her at the launch of her new book, which is non-fiction, which is called No Judgment on Being Critical. And my constant bee in my bonnet I've got about literary criticism, I'm always fascinated by people who do this professionally or people who have more sophisticated thoughts about it than I do. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I wanted to read her novel, and so I got that from the library. And I've really been enjoying it. She is so sharp and funny and sparky. I feel like a point of comparison, certainly with this novel, perhaps might be the Patricia Lockwood book, No One Is Talking About This, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize a couple of years ago, which was written from the point of view of someone who's online on Twitter. It was all written in these very short fragments. It was very funny. It was very insightful about this crazy online world. And Lauren Oyler is doing similar things. The premise of this is that this young woman works as a blogger for a vaguely arts and culture website. She goes to Berlin on a trip. She meets an American expat there who she's interested in, and they do then have a bit of a relationship. And he ends up then moving back to the States, and they become a proper boyfriend-girlfriend couple. But she always has reservations about him. And one day she decides she's going to have a little look at his phone, and she checks his Instagram account, which he's left open, and finds out that he has a secret online life as a conspiracy theorist. And he's actually got this very thriving Instagram account that she knew nothing about, where he is posting all this reactionary, incredibly right-wing stuff, and she can't believe it. And then through some quite convoluted plot contrivances, she ends up back in Berlin He is no longer in the picture. And where I'm up to now, she's trying to make a life for herself there. She's dating. The thing about the plot is it's not really very important. Even she doesn't seem to really care that much about it. It is just this sort of light scaffolding that nods to the fact that books really do need to have some kind of plot in order for her to then weave in all these thoughts and observations about contemporary life and this character's place within it, which seem very much like they might be Oyler's own observations about life and her place within it. But the thing is, they are so clever and they are so sharp and it's so funny and it's all a brilliant sideways glance at everything that I'm completely mesmerised by it. I'm enjoying it so much and I don't care about the fact that the plot, you could sneeze and the plot would blow away. It's like... That's not bothering me. I'm wondering if ultimately at the end I'm not going to find it very satisfying because of that. If it may just fizzle out. But it has been a great source of delight this week. And I do recommend if you haven't read her.
You've sold me. It does sound amazing.
I'd be really interested to know your take on it. I really, really would. All right, we must come on to then our book club book. The New Life by Tom Crewe, which has quite a profile here and continues to do really well. The awards nominations keep coming along. It's been shortlisted for the Cafe Nero Book Awards, which is taking over from the Costa Prize, which is quite a big book prize here in the UK. And it tells the story of two men, John Addington and Henry Ellis. Both of them are married, but these relationships are complicated in different ways. In John's case, it is because he knows himself to be gay and has always known this, and yet he has felt obligated to go through the conventions of marriage and family and children, and that this fact about himself has always had to be something that needed to be concealed. The book, I should say, is set in 1894. So this was at a time when homosexuality was a criminal act, and any public displays you would be hauled off and imprisoned. And then the other character, Henry, is also married, and his marriage is one where he and his wife, Edith, have come to an arrangement that they believe will allow them both freedom. So there's a friendship there, it's rooted in this friendship, but it's also, they've come together because of an ideal that they both have about freedom, and that this marriage will enable them to achieve freedom, and it seems implicit they would be free to see other people, although I think on Henry's side, he's then slightly taken aback when Edith starts a relationship with a woman, Angela, who they meet, and this becomes clear about her, is that she is gay and wants to have relationships with women. And he's a bit unhappy about this, but at the same time still holds true to his principles, and so it's a constantly evolving, renegotiating this relationship between them as the book goes on. And then the thing that brings them together is Henry is a medical man, but they are both writers, and John has written a text which alludes to the idea that among the Greeks, homosexuality was an open thing. It wasn't something that was felt to be wrong. It was accepted part of society. And how have we got to this point where it's now this criminal act? He had written something that addressed this in a veiled way. And then what brings the two men together is their desire to write a book that more explicitly and clearly argues a case for this inclination as being part of the normal range of human sexuality and not something that should be seen as wrong. And although they're not specifically arguing for it to be decriminalised, by arguing for its normality, they're quite bravely trying to make a case that things should change and that society should change, which is what they both want. It's a hard book to sum up. Did I do okay? Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that gets the main points of the plot. I would also say two things. One is that Crewe very much plays with it, but there's a lot of historical fact here. These are basically factual historical characters. He's explicit about it in the afterword, but he then made this dividing line and jumped in and said, I am now going to take serious liberties with the actual history. So you can't read it as a history book, but there is that. And one other key thing here is the Oscar Wilde case. The prosecution of Oscar Wilde happens in the middle of this and very much shifts what these characters do. It's a huge plot point, even though it happens in the background.
Right, because it intensifies. They are just about to publish their book, In an interview I watched with Crewe, he said one thing to realise about this particular period in history is that there was reason for optimism. That in Italy and in France, I believe, it had recently been decriminalised, and there was reason to hope that things might change in Britain as well. And so it wasn't completely crazy of them to write this book and to be so proactively agitating for change, because there was actually not totally unreasonable hope that things might change. But then in the novel, the Oscar Wilde trial blows up. That's the public news story of the day. Opinion is very much against Wilde.
It prompts this huge backlash where suddenly people who had lived ambiguously or very quietly as gay or closeted but still living their lives, it became much more visible, and it became problematic to do that. And the closet became much more problematic because of this crazy late Victorian backlash.
And so the book, which in the novel had just been published, then suddenly it is clear just what they are risking. John's life and his marriage is about to be revealed to be a sham, leaving him very vulnerable, and also, by extension, his wife. And Henry is, I suppose, more aware that his own reputation is about to be compromised. And does he have the courage of his convictions? Is he able to go through with it? I'm dying to hear your thoughts, but before I let you loose, let's just have a quick clip from the audiobook, which is read by Freddie Fox and published by Penguin Audio. So this is how we meet John Addington.
He was close enough to smell the hairs on the back of the man's neck. They almost tickled him, and he tried to rear his head, but found that he was wedged too tightly. There were too many bodies pressed heavily around him. He was slotted into a pattern of hats, shoulders, elbows, knees, feet. He could not move his head even an inch. His gaze had been slotted too, broken off at the edges. He could see nothing but the back of this man's head, the white margin of his collar, the span of his shoulders. He was close enough to smell the pomade, streaks of it shining dully at the man's nape, clingings of eau de cologne, a tang of salt. The suit the man was wearing was blue and grey check. The white collar bit slightly into his skin, fringed by small, whitish hairs. His ears were pink where they curved at the top. His hat, John could barely see higher than the brim, was dark brown with a band in a lighter shade. His hair was brown too, darker where the pomade was daubed. It had recently been cut, a line traced where the barber had shaped it. John could not move his head. His arms were trapped at his sides. There were bodies pressing from right and left, from behind, in front. He flexed his fingers. They brushed coats, dresses, satchels, canes, umbrellas. The train carriage rattled in its frame, thudded on the track underground. The lights wavered, trembling on the cheekbone of the man in front. John hadn't noticed that. Hadn't noticed he could see the angle of the man's jaw and the jut of his cheekbone. There was the hint of a moustache. Blackness rushed past the windows. The floor roared beneath his feet.
And it goes on, and it's a very strong, sensual opening. I found the writing really powerful here. But so generally, there's a lot going on. Tension between the characters and emotional cross-currents as relating to real-life events. How did you feel he handled all of that?
Okay, I think if I was going to criticize a novel, it's the characters. Ultimately, I feel like there's something slightly missing in how deeply I felt about them. I think they are three-dimensional characters, but I wasn't fully immersed in their lives in a way I would hope to. On the other hand, in my mind, that's a slightly incidental criticism, because I would think of this book less as a book about characters than a big novel of ideas. And what he is playing with against that structure of that plot is obviously about the closet and coming out, but it's also about how to engineer social change and how to balance dedication towards your idealistic goals versus responsibilities to your loved ones, and how to, particularly when you're dealing with very deeply embedded social mores, how to negotiate that. And as the plot picks up, I don't want to spoil too much, but I just thought it got exhilarating how these discussions and how they're negotiating it. There's this amazing dinner where there's some pushback against their book. The publisher is prosecuted, and they get some supporters, progressive supporters of the publisher, including, and I think this is true to history, George Bernard Shaw, but they're all supporting it from free speech angle. And then, maybe I'm spoiling too much already, then there is, are they also comfortable with the actual content of this book and with the idea of homosexuality as not being morally wrong? Or even not morally wrong, just how willing are they to balance their ideals with societal conventions? And I thought this was breathtaking, and it was so fascinating, and it made me think of other civil rights books and this and that, but I think asking to what extent it succeeds on the character front is a diversion from what this novel's about.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think that was the heart of my problem with this book, because it was working on two levels to me, and the one that I enjoyed and appreciated is the one that you're talking about. And I feel like it deserves all the praise that it's got for that, for the subject, for the way that he's woven it all together, the way that he's brought that story to life and dramatized it. And he's taken these elements of real life history and he's woven this narrative together to hold this story up in a new way that's really going to resonate with readers. All of that I liked and admired. But on the flip side, these characters I found very unsatisfying. And it's funny, I was struggling to say why, because actually one of the things I think, it was interesting to me, he's not a novelist, first and foremost. His previous career, he's an academic historian, going all the way through to a PhD in 19th century British history. He now works as an editor at the London Review of Books. Not to say that he can't write, none of that means he can't write, but it's interesting to me that he's not first and foremost a novelist, or I feel like he would have always been doing that. And in terms of the writing, I was surprised at how fussy I found it. I felt like the writing itself got in the way of the story he was trying to tell, and that there are things in it that really work and are really good. He's very good at dialogue, conversations between people, and the way that he managed to weave in all the emotional cross-currents and tension I thought was brilliant. It was more the descriptions that fell apart for me, and all of these extraneous details that he's pulling in all the time, which felt like every sentence was so overloaded. I think someone in the book club was saying, if I have to read one more finely wrought simile. And it was a shame because it felt like it bogged it down a bit and got in the way. And on that level, I was surprised at all these comments about the writing and these exquisitely crafted sentences, because I didn't have that reaction to it. And yet I felt like there was so much in it. So I think it's almost like I felt frustrated because there was so much about it I liked and admired, and I felt the actual writing of the book, the way the book was written, it didn't live up to that, weirdly.
I would like to defend the prose a bit there. My guess is what Tom Crewe very much has in mind is the literature of the era. If you go back and read Forster or Henry James or whatever, you do get slightly more turgid sentences. In my mind, none of these felt turgid and it felt very limpid prose, but they are more complex than most contemporary writing. So my guess is that it's a very intentional idea, just really coherent in the era.
But he says here, Phil, one of the characters is having dinner at a restaurant with another character who's a theatre reviewer. And one of the things that I really loved in this book were all the side characters and the men who are woven in, who get to tell their stories, because part of the book that they write, Sexual Inversion, has these testimonies, these anonymous testimonies from men who have been living their lives. And I thought that was so brilliant. Those are the stories that kind of shone for me, and I loved that they were in there. But so Henry's having supper with one of these characters, Jack. He says, a smile hooked across Jack's face, ear to ear. Does it ever occur to you that the new life might be easier for some people to live than for others? I do not think it's easy for anyone. It requires a leap. But the gap is wider if you are in defiance of the law than if you simply choose to live apart from your wife. We're not breaking the law by publishing this book. No, but Jack's teeth shone in apology. And I underlined it. His teeth shone in apology. What does that mean? That's just one example. There's another one here I pulled out. when John meets his daughter's husband, Stanley, or his relationship with his daughter's husband, Stanley, which, again, is very interesting. And I felt really wove in all this interesting stuff about his relationship to another heterosexual man who didn't obviously know that he was gay, and his own feelings about that man. And all of that was so interesting and nuanced. But then this bit of description, there was something very attractive about him. His freshness, the permanent untidiness of his hair and feathery moustache, combined with the beautiful suits Maud encouraged him to buy, which he wore with a combination of pride and indifference, forgetting to button his jackets, but looking satisfiedly at the brightness of the silk linings, stroking them with the back of his hands. And I was like, satisfiedly? Now I feel like you're going to tell me that this is a word that people used at the time. That's just 2 examples that I've pulled, but it was full of things like that. And I kept tripping over them because it kept drawing my attention to the writing, and I couldn't get past it. And yet, I did. There was so much in this that I liked. And there was one point where this is the last bit I'll quote. He says, "At these moments it came back to him, as it did with particular smells and sounds, the stale sunshine stored in the fabric of a deck chair, the shushing of a fountain in a park, the nibble of a paper knife, the warm, fleeting feeling of last summer's friendship." And that sentence, when I read it, I thought, yes, every part of that sentence resonated with me, and I loved it and evoked something in my mind. But that was the only time it happened. That's why I noticed it, because there I thought, yes, that works. And all the other times he'd done it felt contrived to me in a way that I couldn't get past, this fussy quality. But how interesting, though, because I'd be totally willing to concede my own ignorance. I have not read a lot of writing from this period. If he's evoking something I don't know and doing it cleverly, that would completely recast my feelings about it. If that's what's going on, I like that you've introduced that thought. He gives a reading list of other things if you're curious to know more about the subject, and I absolutely was and am. I'd be interested to know then, perhaps when I've done a little bit more reading around the subject, whether it starts to make more sense to me the way that he wrote it.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I read this, I think maybe a year ago, when I'd gone through a phase of reading 4 or 5 E.M. Forsters, who is 10 years after this, basically, when he starts writing his books. And possibly because that was in my ear, none of the examples you just gave really jumped out at me as problematic.
Did you listen to it or did you read it?
I think I listened.
Yeah, I wonder if that would change things.
But I've also been, over the past year, going through Henry James, who is much fussier and much more crazy sentences. So these examples, they did not bog me down at all.
Yeah, interesting. And the only other point of criticism that came up in the book club that I think is an interesting one is the character of Henry. Of the two, he feels the more opaque. He's the harder one to really understand. There was uneasiness about that character because it feels like he should be a character you admire, who's principled and is doing something meaningful. And yet, strangely, it wasn't completely obvious that he was that character in a way that seemed slightly strange. But then I was looking online, as I often do, looking around to see how other readers have responded to the book. I came across a review on Goodreads by a reviewer called Roman Claudia, who flagged up something I thought was really interesting that I hadn't seen anywhere else. They gave it 2 stars and said, "While I'm all there for the narrative intention behind this book, a story promoting the normalisation, acceptance and decriminalisation of homosexuality in the late 19th century, I found the execution bland, with stilted writing and the erasure of some of the more interesting historical and intellectual complexities. The protagonists, John Addington and Henry Ellis, are thinly disguised avatars for John Addington Symonds, classicist and critic, and Henry Havelock Ellis, the sexologist, who collaborated on the real book, Sexual Inversion. Both were married, both were what we'd now term gay. That's more or less the story of this book, interspersed with sex scenes that feel cold and unsexy. I don't actually agree with that. I liked the way that sex was written about in this book. I certainly didn't find it cold. That as an aside. The title comes from the Real Life Society, the Fellowship of the New Life, which was a sort of utopian catch-all that promoted the idea of a simple life, less competition, spiritual rather than materialist interests, vegetarianism. More interestingly, and where this book doesn't really go, is that this was the origin from which the socialist activist Fabian Society emerged, and, ultimately, the Labour Party. Sadly, this book flattens the political context. It also erases some of the more problematic aspects of the real Havelock Ellis in the creation of Henry. Ellis was a prominent eugenicist, vice president of the Eugenics Society in the early 20th century, believing in social hygiene, i.e. that people with unwanted characteristics should never be born. He also believed in the not unconnected idea of racial hierarchies with non-Western races and cultures deemed inferior to white Western cultures and race. How much more interesting this book might have been if Henry Ellis had been shown negotiating his belief that men should be free to love other men and women, whilst simultaneously navigating his classist and racist ideologies. But this book sticks to a simpler and more palatable narrative arc and characterization so that we can all get behind the idea of sexual freedom. Which is fine, there's no requirement for any author to be a social activist. It just would have made this book more complex and interesting for me. As it is, and quite apart from the smoothing out of problematic real history, I found the exposition-heavy style and self-conscious prose came between me and the story. This is a book where we need to be fully immersed in the story. I always felt on the outside, looking in to what someone had written.
That experience of reading the prose certainly chimed with me, but what I was fascinated by was this detail about the real Havelock Ellis. I didn't know about him or that side of the story, but what I
had was a kind of uneasiness throughout. The tension between the real-life facts, which I found fascinating and was very interested in, and the way that he'd chosen to weave them together in fictional form. There was something a bit uneasy about that always, and when I found that out about the real Havelock Ellis, it made sense to me that the character of Henry felt so ambiguous and unclear, because at some points the connection... What I said in the book club was that he obviously wanted to write about sexual inversion, and he was stuck with Havelock Ellis, and so he had to kind of like transmute him into this character of Henry, which is what we get, who is someone that you can get behind. I didn't understand where it was coming from when I read the book, but I did sense that, and I was not sure about it.
I do remember reading that review on Goodreads when I read this a year ago. My reaction is the same now, where I never buy criticism where criticizing the novelist, or the creator for not creating the book that the reader wants. It's very clear that it's a very different product. I fully agree that a full exploration of the actual historical figures and their times and how they interacted with progressive English at the time would be fascinating, but it's very much not what Crewe was trying to do here.
Yeah, I don't know. At the end of his afterword, he says, "Notwithstanding I have written a novel purely with a novelist's intentions, I would be pleased if I have managed to contribute something to our store of understanding. Truths needn't always depend on facts for their expression." And I found that sentence quite extraordinary. That's a paradox to me. And I can't quite believe a historian would say that.
Because he's not being an historian here. He's being a novelist, and he's exploring these issues. Why I felt it was so enthralling is because it's not specifically about one period in time in the 1890s in London. It felt equally applicable to completely different times and places with different issues, because he's trying to unlock a lot of... That's what this novel of ideas is. He's using that specific time and place to explore much broader themes that are relevant to 1960s US, or there's plenty of examples. And therefore, I think what he's saying is his job in this novel was not to stick to the facts. He was not being an historian in this role. He was using that history and then very clearly saying, I'm now going to use this for my own purposes to do a novelist thing, not to do a historian's thing.
I would have loved it if he had done that, but it was so carefully and minutely and in such a detailed way specific to this one very precise place and time and moment in history that I was unable to see what you obviously saw in it, which is the wider reach. I didn't get that. But I mean, it's good. This is great. I love this because you're helping me see it in a new light. The book club and I were kind of on the same page with it. No one disliked it. I asked them at the end to give scores, and we went round and people gave scores out of 5, and everyone gave it 3 or 3.5. So no one thought it was a bad book. Everyone finished it. But one person did refer to it as what she calls a kitchen timer read. There was a sort of slightly dutiful quality to picking it up. Okay, I'm going to read for 20 minutes and then being able to put it down. And then I didn't find that, but I did take it away with me on holiday. I started it, and then I found myself putting it down, and I only picked it up again when it came to reading it for book club. Even for me, it had a slightly homeworky quality. But I in no way regretted reading it. I was pleased to have read it. I just wanted to really love it. And it had that problem that books often have when they come so highly praised. It had been on so many best of lists at the end of last year, and it's won these various awards, and I feel it's going to keep winning more. And he seems so interesting and such a likable person, and he's very embedded in the literary world, which counts for a lot, I think, when it comes to the way that these things are judged. I don't know. Yeah, I was just a bit disappointed by it. I think it was a lot to do with the fact that I really would just love to read Tom Crewe's non-fiction account of this period of history. And I mean, him on the Oscar Wilde trial and all of that, I would really enjoy that. And I felt like that's not the book I got. And yeah, now what I'm realizing is that perhaps I never got past my own desire for the book to be something other than what it was. But you clearly didn't feel that way. If you were asked to score it out of 5, what do you think you'd give it?
I'd probably give it a 4.5. I thought it was one of the books that was legitimately hyped up and really lived up to it. I thought it was more successful than the Zadie Smith in terms of fraud. That's a fascinating one, and for sure recommend it. But in terms of using that historical scene to think broader, I thought Tom Crewe was slightly more successful, but I didn't think it was a perfect book.
Before we get to our book recommendations, let me just take a moment to tell you about some of the ways you can support us here at the Book Club Review. One is completely free, and that is to rate and review the show, which helps other people find it. But wait, there's more. If you'd like a weekly email from me full of book recommendations to help you figure out what you would enjoy reading next, access to our podcast spreadsheets, and the opportunity to connect with other listeners and share thoughts on books via our chat group, then you can sign up to our Patreon. At the higher tier, you can become a member of our monthly book club, which meets via Zoom. Check the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/The Book Club Review for the different membership tiers and benefits, and the details of book club reads coming up. And to our wonderful community of Patreons currently supporting the show, as ever, a huge thank you. Inspired by the new life, here are some more books we recommend. Phil, what have you got?
Have you read Morris, the E.M. Forster? So that is not the book, but that is, Morris is the E.M. Forster book that he wrote because E.M. Forster was very much gay, but also married to a woman and very closeted, or at least publicly closeted. I don't think to friends, but Morris was his book about an actual gay romance and struggling with homosexuality in pre-World War I Edwardian England. Towards the end of it, there's this romance between Morris, this character, and this working class gardener at the estate called Alec Scudder. And 3 years ago, William DiCanzio put out this gorgeous book called Alec. The first third, fourth of it is Morris, but told from the perspective of Alec. And then it takes them forward beyond where Morris ends, through the war, into the 20s, maybe even a bit longer. And it's gorgeously written, and it's ultimately just a romance, but it's set in the same time, or just after where A New Life is, and very successiul.
That sounds so perfect. I'm so impressed that you came up with something that sounds like such a perfect... I might read that.
You should start with Morris and then read Alec. Alec, I think, is better than Morris. I'm actually not really a Forster fan.
I don't think I've ever, apart from Howard's End.
I think his best one is A Passage to India, but...
Yeah.
A couple of things that came up in the book club discussion. One was Young Bloomsbury by Nino Strachey, which is a really interesting exploration of how the Bloomsbury group offered a certain model or pathway for the generation who came after them in terms of living unconventional lives without judgment or censure. It's non-fiction, but it is a fascinating look at almost the next chapter of British history as the 20th century moved on. And we have a whole podcast episode dedicated to that, which you'll find in our archive. I'll link to it in the show notes. The other book that came up in the book club was Blackouts by Justin Torres, which a couple of the book club members had read and thought highly of. I haven't read it. I will just read you the publisher's blurb. Out in the desert, in a place called The Palace, a young man tends to a dying soul, someone he once knew briefly, but who has haunted the edges of his life, Juan Gay. Playful raconteur, child lost and found and lost, guardian of the institutionalized, Juan has a project to pass along, one built around a true artifact of a book. Sex Variance, a study of homosexual patterns, and its devastating history. This book contains accounts collected in the early 20th century from queer subjects by a queer researcher, Jan Gay, whose groundbreaking work was then co-opted by a committee, her name buried. The voices of these subjects have been filtered, muted, but it is possible to hear them from within and beyond the text, which, in Juan's tattered volumes, has been redacted with black marker on nearly every page. As Juan waits for his end, he and the narrator recount for each other moments of joy and oblivion. They resurrect loves, lives, mothers, fathers, minor heroes. In telling their own stories and the story of the book, they resist the ravages of memory and time. The past is with us, beside us, ahead of us. What are we to create from its gaps and erasures? A book about storytelling, its legacies, dangers, delights, and potential for change, and a bold exploration of form, art, and love. Justin Torres' Blackouts uses fiction to see through the inventions of history and narrative. A marvel of creative imagination, it draws on testimony, photographs, illustrations, and a range of influences as it insists that we look long and steadily at what we have inherited and what we have made. A world full of ghostly shadows and flashing moments of truth. A reclamation of ransacked history, a celebration of defiance, and a transformative encounter. Blackouts mines the stories that have been kept from us and brings them into the light. It won a National Book Award in America. It's apparently a much more challenging read than The New Life, but there is an interesting parallel there, isn't there, in terms of the use of real-life historical sources and then weaving a narrative from them. And the other thing I came across when I was looking around online was that on bookshop.org, they do this nice thing where they get writers to curate lists, and they got Tom Crewe to do one. And I was reading that with interest, and he recommended a book that I had never heard of. Have you ever heard of a book called Miss Marjoribanks by Margaret Oliphant?
No.
So it turns out Margaret Oliphant was an incredibly prolific 19th century novelist. She actually makes his list twice, his list of 10. Miss Marjoribanks is one of the books he recommends, and the other one is The Ladies Lindores. About that one, he says, I make no apology for having Mrs. Oliphant on this list twice. It is enraging that this wonderful British novelist is so little read or even known about, and that so much of her work has not been republished by the major publishing houses. But the one of the two that really caught my attention was Miss Marjoribanks. This is a delightful comic masterpiece that everyone should read, and the most interesting book about men written by a 19th century woman. The novel tells the story of Miss Marjoribanks and of her return after finishing her schooling to live with her widowed father in Carlingford. Miss Marjoribanks, Lucilla to her intimates, fully intends to revolutionise Carlingford, and quickly does, establishing regular Thursday evenings and an unbreakable social ascendancy. There are people, Oliphant writes, who talk of themselves and think of themselves, as it were, under protest, and with depreciation, not actually able to convince themselves that anybody cares. But Lucilla, for her part, had the calmest and most profound conviction that when she discussed her own doings and plans and clevernesses, she was bringing forward the subject most interesting to her audience, as well as to herself. Such a conviction is never without its fruits. Which I made me feel a bit of a almost Flora Post in Cold Comfort Farm vibe. I love the sound of this character. One of these fruits is an instrumental view of men, considered simple material for Miss Marjoribanks's genius. Simple because everybody knows that it requires very little to satisfy the gentleman if a woman will only give her mind to it. Lucilla recognises that wives are tied to their husbands, so she lays on dinners perfected for male palates in order to secure their attendance at her Thursdays, after which they are put to honest work. And yeah, I'd never heard of this author. He's clearly a big fan, probably in no way relates to The New Life, apart from the fact that its author, Tom Crewe, is highly recommending it, and so I throw it in here.
What's the name of it again?
It's called Miss Marjoribanks. Marjoribanks. I'll put the link in the show notes. And the other one was called The Ladies Lindores. The Ladies Lindores showcases Mrs. Oliphant's traditional trademark qualities: a close attention to the experience of women, especially in marriage, a critical treatment of men, but a sympathetic understanding of the demands of a constructed masculinity, a refusal to endorse easy or traditional assumptions, complex, self-scrutinizing characters with shifting motivations, a wise and witty sensibility, just in view behind a fine prose style. The same things could be said of A Country Gentleman and His Family, and Hester, to name just two more of her 98 novels. 98 novels!
As happens so often, once again, I'm humbled by how little I know about all the fine books that there are in this world. Phil, it has been such a delight discussing this with you. I really enjoyed you pushing back on a few things, which is great, and what book club discussion is all about. No question in my mind. It was an excellent book club book. It was a good discussion book, and I think a worthwhile read. And listeners, you'll be able to decide from what we've said if you think that it's one for you. That's nearly it for this episode, which was edited and produced by me, Kate Sotover, here in London. Whenever you listen to it, if you have thoughts, we would love to hear them. Comment anytime on the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, linked in the show notes, which is also the place to go for an episode transcript. Comments there go straight to our inboxes, so drop us a line. We always love to hear from you. Between episodes, I'm also busy as a bee over on Patreon. Come and sign up for weekly newsletters, extra episodes, and at the higher tier, come and join the pod's monthly book club. All the details are at patreon.com/The Book Club Review. It would be great to have you there, and you'll be financially supporting the show. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads at Book Club Review Podcast, or get in touch direct at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you enjoy our shows and want to do a nice thing in return, please do leave us a quick star rating and review, which helps future listeners find us. But for now, thanks for listening, and happy book clubbing.